Petty Officer Second Class Sarah Martinez moved through the ammunition storage compartment with practiced efficiency. Her steel-toed boots echoing against the metal deck plates of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The massive aircraft carrier cut through the Pacific waters at 25 knots. But down here in the belly of the ship, the only indication of movement was the subtle vibration that every sailor learned to ignore after their first week aboard. Sarah hefted another 20mm ammunition canister, her lean frame belying the strength required to handle the heavy ordnance. At 26, she had been in the Navy for 8 years, long enough to know every inch of the weapons handling areas, every safety protocol, and every shortcut that could save precious seconds during combat operations. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her utilities bore the crisp creases that spoke of military pride. But there was something about the way she carried herself. A careful, measured quality that suggested someone who preferred to remain unnoticed. The morning watch was always quiet in the ammunition storage areas. Most of the air wing personnel were either in their racks, catching sleep between missions, or up on the flight deck preparing for the day's first launch. Sarah preferred these early hours, when she could work methodically through her checklist without the usual chaos that came with flight operations. The ammunition had to be ready, organized, and accounted for before the day's missions began, and she took that responsibility seriously. As she worked, her hand unconsciously moved to her chest, fingers briefly touching something beneath her uniform blouse. The gesture lasted only a moment before she caught herself and returned to her task, but it was a habit she had developed over the past 18 months. A reflexive check to ensure that what she kept hidden remained so. The compartment door opened with a metallic clang, and Seaman Rodriguez stepped inside, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and looking like he needed it desperately. "Morning, Petty Officer Martinez," he said, stifling a yawn. "Ready for another exciting day of moving boom around the ship?" Sarah smiled despite herself. Rodriguez was 19, fresh from ammunition handling school, and still possessed the enthusiasm that military service had a way of tempering over time. "Every day's exciting when you're handling enough firepower to level a city block, Rodriguez. Just remember that." "Yes, ma'am. Petty Officer." Rodriguez set his coffee aside and grabbed a manifest clipboard. "Chief wants the 20 mic rounds staged for loading by 0800. Something about the air wing running low after yesterday's training exercises." "Training exercises," Sarah repeated, shaking her head. The term seemed inadequate for what had actually happened the day before. The carrier group had encountered what intelligence later confirmed was a probe by hostile submarines, and several of the F/A-18 Super Hornets had expended more ammunition than planned during the response. Not enough to constitute combat, but enough to remind everyone that their position in the South China Sea was anything but routine patrol duty. The two sailors worked in comfortable silence for the next hour, moving ammunition canisters, updating inventory sheets, and ensuring that every round was properly secured for transfer to the flight deck. Sarah had trained Rodriguez well over the past 6 months, and he had progressed from nervous recruit to competent ammunition handler. She took quiet pride in that accomplishment, though she would never voice it. Recognition was something she actively avoided. At 0750, they finished staging the ammunition for the first batch of aircraft. Rodriguez wiped sweat from his forehead and checked his watch. "Right on time." "Chief's going to be happy." "Chief's never happy," Sarah replied, but there was affection in her voice. Chief Petty Officer Johnson ran the ammunition division with the kind of exacting standards that kept everyone alive in a job where mistakes were measured in body counts. But he'll be less unhappy than usual. As they secured the compartment for transfer operations, Sarah's fingers once again moved to her chest. That brief, involuntary gesture that had become as natural as breathing. This time, Rodriguez noticed. "You okay, Petty Officer? You keep doing that thing with your shirt?" Sarah's hand dropped immediately. "Just checking my name tape. Sometimes the Velcro comes loose in the humidity down here." It was a reasonable explanation, and Rodriguez accepted it without question. The truth was something Sarah had never spoken aloud to anyone aboard the carrier. Beneath her uniform blouse, hanging on a simple chain around her neck, was a medal that she had never officially received and never wanted anyone to discover. The weight of it was negligible. A few ounces of metal and ribbon, but it felt heavier than any ammunition canister she had ever lifted. The medal was the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, the service's highest non-combat decoration for heroism. It had been presented to her in a private ceremony 18 months ago, following an incident that the Navy preferred to keep quiet. The official citation mentioned her extraordinary heroism and voluntary risk of life during a rescue operation, but the sanitized language could not capture what had actually happened on that night when everything went wrong. Sarah preferred it that way. The last thing she wanted was the attention that came with being known as a hero. Heroes attracted scrutiny, and scrutiny led to expectations she was not sure she could meet again. Better to be Petty Officer Martinez, competent ammunition handler, than to be the sailor who had done something that earned her a medal she could not bring herself to wear openly. The intercom crackled to life with the morning announcement. "Now hear this. Now hear this. All hands prepare for flight quarters. Flight quarters. Flight quarters." The familiar words signaled the beginning of another day of flight operations. The complex dance of launching and recovering aircraft that was the primary mission of any aircraft carrier. Sarah and Rodriguez made their final equipment checks and prepared to move topside to the weapons staging area. As they climbed the ladders toward the flight deck level, Sarah could feel the familiar acceleration of the ship as it turned into the wind for aircraft launch operations. The sound of jet engines spooling up filtered down through the steel structure, a reminder that their work with ammunition was just the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous process. On the hangar deck, the organized chaos of flight operations was already underway. Plane captains performed final checks on their aircraft while ordnance personnel loaded missiles and ammunition into the various weapon systems. The Air Wing's F/A-18 Super Hornets and F-35C Lightning II fighters gleamed under the fluorescent lights, their weapons pylons waiting to receive the ordnance that Sarah and her team had prepared. As Sarah supervised the loading of 20mm ammunition into the aircraft's internal guns, she noticed increased activity among the senior officers. Captain Reynolds, the ship's commanding officer, was in deep conversation with Commander Hayes from the Air Wing, their body language suggesting that this was more than routine planning. Whatever had them concerned, it was serious enough to bring both men to the hangar deck during critical pre-flight operations. "Heads up," Rodriguez murmured, nodding toward the officers. "Looks like we might be doing more than training exercises today." Sarah followed his gaze and felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The same feeling she had experienced 18 months ago, when routine patrol duty had suddenly become something much more dangerous. The same feeling that had led to her receiving a medal she could never acknowledge. She touched her chest again, that unconscious gesture betraying her inner tension. The medal seemed to grow heavier as she watched the officers' urgent conference, and for a moment, she wondered if the time was coming when her desire to remain unnoticed would conflict with her duty to serve. It was a question she hoped she would never have to answer, but as the officers dispersed and new orders began flowing through the chain of command, Sarah had the sinking feeling that her carefully maintained anonymity was about to be tested. The flight deck announcement system came alive with new instructions. "All department heads report to the bridge for immediate briefing. All department heads report to the bridge." The urgency in the communications officer's voice was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who had served long enough to recognize the difference between routine and crisis. As Sarah continued her work, loading ammunition with the same methodical precision she had demonstrated countless times before, she could not shake the feeling that the careful balance she had maintained for 18 months was about to shift. Somewhere above them, decisions were being made that would affect every person aboard the carrier, and she found herself hoping that whatever was coming would not require the kind of heroism that earned medals, the kind that she had promised herself she would never display again. The weight of the hidden medal against her chest served as a constant reminder of what happened when ordinary sailors were forced to do extraordinary things. And as the USS Gerald R. Ford continued its passage through increasingly troubled waters, Sarah Martinez continued her work, determined to remain just another ammunition handler in a crew of 5,000, even as circumstances beyond her control began to converge in ways that would soon make that impossible. The morning sun climbed higher over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the flight deck above, while deep in the ship's ammunition spaces, a decorated hero tried desperately to remain invisible. 3 hours after the urgent briefing, Sarah noticed the change in the ship's rhythm. The USS Gerald R. Ford had altered course twice, and the flight operations that should have been routine training missions had taken on the unmistakable characteristics of real-world tasking. Aircraft were being loaded with live ordnance instead of training rounds, and the weapons staging area buzzed with the kind of focused intensity that only came when lives were potentially at stake. Admiral Catherine Reyes arrived aboard the carrier via helicopter at 1,300 hours. Her presence immediately felt throughout the ship, even though most of the crew never saw her. Sarah was in weapons storage compartment 3 when word filtered down through the enlisted ranks that a 2-star admiral was aboard for operational consultations, which was military speak for something significant is happening, and we need senior leadership to make decisions. Admiral Reyes was legendary in the Pacific Fleet, known for her tactical brilliance during the Taiwan crisis 3 years earlier, and her ability to see details that others missed. At 52, she had risen through the ranks by combining technical expertise with an intuitive understanding of naval warfare that had earned her the respect of peers and subordinates alike. She also had a reputation for walking the ship during crisis situations, appearing in compartments where admirals typically never ventured, talking to sailors at every level to get a complete picture of the ship's readiness. Sarah was conducting an ammunition count when Chief Johnson appeared in the compartment doorway, his expression more serious than usual. "Martinez, I need you to brief the weapons status to some VIPs in 10 minutes. Clean uniform. By the book, no room for mistakes." "Who am I briefing, Chief?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Admiral Reyes and her staff. They want a complete rundown of our ordnance capabilities and current stores. You know this stuff better than anyone else in the division." Sarah's stomach clenched. She had been successful in avoiding high-visibility assignments for 18 months, always managing to direct attention to other qualified personnel when opportunities for recognition arose. But when an admiral specifically requested a briefing from the ammunition division, there was no way to remain invisible. "Can't Petty Officer Stevens handle it? He's senior to me. Stevens is in sick bay with food poisoning. You're up, Martinez." And Sarah? Chief Johnson's use of her first name was rare enough to get her attention. "This isn't the time to be modest. The Admiral needs accurate information to make decisions that could affect this entire battle group. Do your job." 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself in the Weapons Control Center, standing before a table where Admiral Reyes and 3 other senior officers were studying tactical displays and intelligence reports. The Admiral was smaller than Sarah had expected, but she radiated the kind of quiet authority that made her presence fill the entire compartment. "Petty Officer Martinez," Admiral Reyes said without looking up from her papers, "I understand you're the subject matter expert on our ammunition status." "Yes, ma'am." Sarah's voice was steady despite her nervousness. "I have the current inventory reports for all ordnance types. Before we get to the numbers, tell me about our ammunition handling capabilities. If we needed to conduct sustained operations for 72 hours, what would be our limiting factors?" It was the kind of question that required more than just reading from reports. Sarah took a breath and began explaining the complex logistics of ammunition movement, the personnel requirements for different types of ordnance, and the potential bottlenecks that could develop during extended combat operations. As she spoke, she noticed Admiral Reyes watching her intently, not just listening to her words but observing her delivery, her confidence, and her depth of knowledge. "Your assessment of our 20mm ammunition is particularly concerning," the Admiral said when Sarah finished. "You mentioned potential supply chain issues. Elaborate on that." Sarah explained the technical challenges of manufacturing 20mm rounds to Navy specifications, the limited number of suppliers, and the time required to transport ammunition to forward-deployed ships. As she spoke about logistics and supply considerations, she found herself relaxing slightly. This was technical information, the kind of briefing that focused on facts rather than personalities. "Excellent analysis," Admiral Reyes said. "Now, I have a hypothetical scenario for you. Suppose we had to defend this battle group against a coordinated attack involving both air and surface threats. What would be your recommended ammunition distribution to maximize our defensive capabilities?" The question was clearly not hypothetical, and Sarah realized she was being asked to provide tactical input that would influence actual operational decisions. She outlined her recommendations, discussing the optimal mix of air-to-air missiles, surface attack munitions, and defensive ammunition for the ship's close-in weapon systems. Her suggestions were based on years of experience and training, but also on something deeper: an intuitive understanding of naval combat that came from having been tested in real situations. As Sarah spoke, Admiral Reyes continued to study her with an attention that made her increasingly uncomfortable. There was something in the Admiral's expression that suggested recognition, though Sarah was certain they had never met. When she finished her briefing, the Admiral thanked her and dismissed her. But Sarah could feel those sharp eyes following her as she left the compartment. 2 hours later, Sarah was back in the ammunition storage areas when Rodriguez found her with disturbing news. "Petty officer, something weird just happened. Some guy in a dress uniform came looking for you. Said he was from the Admiral's staff and wanted to verify some personnel information." Sarah's heart rate spiked. "What kind of personnel information? Your service record, previous duty assignments, stuff like that. I told him you were busy with weapons loading, but he said he'd be back." Rodriguez paused, studying Sarah's expression. "Everything okay? You look like you saw a ghost." Before Sarah could answer, the compartment door opened again, and Yeoman First Class Thompson from the ship's administration office stepped inside. Thompson was holding a tablet and wearing the expression of someone who had been tasked with something he did not quite understand. "Petty Officer Martinez? Admiral Reyes requests that you report to her quarters at 1,800 hours. Dress blue uniform." Thompson consulted his tablet. "She also requested that you bring any personal awards or commendations that might not be reflected in your official service record." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Rodriguez looked confused, but Thompson's expression suggested he was merely delivering a message without understanding its significance. Sarah managed to maintain her composure long enough to acknowledge the order and dismiss both sailors. But once she was alone, she sat heavily on an ammunition crate and tried to steady her breathing. Admiral Reyes knew, somehow, despite all of Sarah's efforts to keep her past buried, the Admiral had figured it out. The careful attention during the briefing, the questions about her background, the request for information about awards. It all pointed to one conclusion: Sarah's 18-month effort to remain invisible was about to end. The Navy and Marine Corps medal hanging around her neck felt like it weighed 100 pounds. She pulled it out from beneath her uniform and looked at it for the first time in months. The bronze medal depicted an eagle perched on an anchor, surrounded by a circle of 13 stars. The ribbon was navy blue with thin yellow and red stripes, colors that she had once worn with pride but now saw as a beacon drawing unwanted attention. The citation that came with the medal was burned into her memory, even though she had never read it aloud to anyone. "For extraordinary heroism and voluntary risk of life, above and beyond the call of duty during rescue operations, following the catastrophic explosion aboard the USS Milwaukee on 15 March 2023. Petty Officer Martinez, without regard for her own safety, repeatedly entered smoke-filled compartments to rescue injured personnel, saving 17 lives before the compartment was fully evacuated. Her actions reflected great credit upon herself and the United States Navy." What the citation did not mention was that Sarah had been off duty when the explosion occurred, had no specific rescue training, and had been ordered by senior personnel to remain clear of the damaged areas. What it did not capture was the terror she felt as she crawled through twisted metal and toxic smoke, or the nightmares that followed for months afterward. And what it certainly did not convey was her absolute certainty that she never wanted to be in a situation where such heroism was required again. The medal represented everything Sarah wanted to forget about herself. The tendency to act without considering consequences. The inability to ignore others' suffering even when prudence demanded it, and the willingness to risk everything for people she barely knew. She had accepted the medal because refusing it would have caused more attention than accepting it. But she had never worn it publicly, and had hoped that by keeping it hidden, she could somehow avoid becoming the person who had earned it. Sarah spent the next 2 hours completing her ammunition duties while wrestling with what she would tell Admiral Reyes. The truth seemed both inevitable and impossible. She could not lie to a flag officer, but she also could not bear the thought of being seen as someone special, someone who might be expected to perform heroics again when circumstances demanded it. As 1,800 hours approached, Sarah changed into her dress blue uniform in the small compartment she shared with 3 other petty officers. The navy blue jumper and white shirt felt foreign after months of working in utilities. But it was the weight of the medal that bothered her most. She could leave it hidden, but Admiral Reyes had specifically requested any awards not reflected in her official record. Disobeying a direct order from a flag officer was not an option. At exactly 1,800, Sarah knocked on the door to Admiral Reyes's quarters. The compartment was larger than any space she had seen on the ship, but still modest by civilian standards. The Admiral was seated behind a small desk, still wearing her working uniform, and she gestured for Sarah to take the single chair across from her. "Petty Officer Martinez, thank you for coming. Before we begin, I want you to know that this conversation is entirely off the record. Nothing you say here will appear in any official documentation unless you specifically request it." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "I've been reviewing your service record, and I find it interesting that someone with your obvious capabilities has managed to avoid any significant recognition for the past 18 months. In fact, your record is almost suspiciously ordinary for someone with your demonstrated expertise." Admiral Reyes leaned back in her chair, her expression patient but determined. "I also find it interesting that your previous commanding officer, Captain Morrison, refused to discuss your performance aboard the USS Milwaukee, beyond saying that you were an outstanding sailor who deserves privacy. That kind of protective language usually indicates something significant happened." Sarah remained silent, but she could feel the weight of the hidden medal as if it were broadcasting its presence. "So," Admiral Reyes continued, "I'm going to ask you directly, is there something in your background that would help me understand why the most knowledgeable ammunition technician in this battle group has been working so hard to remain invisible?" Admiral Reyes examined the Navy and Marine Corps medal with the reverence it deserved, turning it over in her hands to read the inscription on the back. When she looked up, her expression had softened, but her eyes remained intent. "March 15th, 2023, she said quietly. "The USS Milwaukee's ammunition storage explosion. I remember reading the initial incident reports. 17 sailors rescued from compartments that should have been impossible to enter safely." She handed the medal back to Sarah. "What I didn't know was who had done the rescuing." Sarah accepted the medal, but did not put it away. "I was hoping no one would ever have to know, ma'am. Tell me what happened that night." For 18 months, Sarah had avoided speaking about the Milwaukee incident to anyone. She had undergone mandatory counseling sessions where she provided clinical descriptions of events, answered investigators' questions with precise technical details, and accepted the medal in a private ceremony where she spoke only when required to acknowledge the honor. But she had never actually told the story. Not in a way that conveyed the terror, the desperation, and the impossible choices that had defined those 47 minutes of her life. "There was no warning," Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper. "One moment I was in my rack reading, and the next moment the ship was shaking like it was coming apart. The explosion happened in ammunition storage compartment 7, right below the berthing area where most of the off-duty weapons personnel were sleeping." Admiral Reyes listened without interruption as Sarah described the chaos that followed. Emergency lighting, smoke-filled passageways, and the awful realization that 17 people were trapped in compartments where the normal escape routes had been blocked by twisted metal and debris. Damage control teams were focused on preventing secondary explosions and maintaining the ship's stability. But the trapped personnel were in spaces that the emergency responders could not safely access. The senior chief ordered everyone to stay clear while they figured out a safe way to conduct rescue operations, Sarah continued. "But I knew those compartments better than anyone else. I had been working in ammunition storage for 3 years, and I knew every access panel, every maintenance crawlway, every structural weak point that could be exploited." "So you disobeyed the order to stay clear?" "Yes, ma'am. I found a route through the ventilation system that led to the damaged compartments. It was barely wide enough for a person, filled with smoke, and structurally unsound, but it was the only way to reach the trapped sailors before the compartment flooded or suffered secondary explosions." Sarah described crawling through spaces never meant for human passage, guided only by emergency lighting and the voices of trapped personnel calling for help. She made 17 trips through that route, each time pulling an unconscious or injured sailor to safety, each time knowing that the next trip might be her last, as the damaged structure continued to deteriorate around her. The worst part wasn't the physical danger, Sarah said, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. It was having to choose who to rescue first, based on who had the best chance of survival. Medical triage in a combat zone, except it was my shipmates, people I ate meals with and worked alongside every day. Admiral Reyes remained silent for several moments after Sarah finished. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had made life and death decisions throughout her career. Petty Officer Martinez, you saved 17 lives through extraordinary courage and technical expertise. Why does that feel like a burden to you instead of an accomplishment? The question struck at the heart of what Sarah had been struggling with for 18 months. Because I can't do it again, ma'am. People look at that medal and they expect me to be someone who can handle impossible situations, who can make those kinds of decisions under pressure. But I was terrified the entire time. I almost got everyone killed, including myself, because I couldn't think clearly, couldn't make good decisions. I got lucky, not heroic. Sarah, Admiral Reyes said, using her first name deliberately, I've been in combat situations where split-second decisions determined whether people lived or died. The fact that you were terrified doesn't diminish what you accomplished. The fact that you thought you were making bad decisions doesn't change the fact that 17 families got their loved ones back because of your actions. Before Sarah could respond, Admiral Reyes's secure communication device beeped with an urgent message. The Admiral read the display, and her expression immediately became grim. We need to continue this conversation, but circumstances have just changed dramatically. Admiral Reyes stood and moved to her secure terminal. 3 hours ago, a Chinese submarine launched torpedoes at a Philippines patrol vessel 80 miles from our current position. The patrol vessel is dead in the water with significant casualties, and our battle group has been ordered to provide immediate assistance. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest as Admiral Reyes continued the briefing. The problem is that the submarine is still in the area, possibly waiting for us to respond so they can engage our ships. We need to conduct rescue operations while maintaining defensive posture, which means we need maximum ammunition readiness for sustained combat operations. Ma'am, our ammunition status is solid for normal operations. But if you're talking about simultaneous rescue operations and anti-submarine warfare, we'll need to reconfigure our entire weapons loadout in under 6 hours. Exactly. And according to your brief this afternoon, you're the only person aboard this ship who has both the technical expertise and the operational experience to manage that kind of complex ammunition redistribution under combat conditions. Sarah realized where this conversation was heading, and she felt the same sick feeling in her stomach that she had experienced 18 months ago when she first heard the voices of trapped sailors calling for help. Ma'am, I can provide technical guidance to Chief Johnson and the senior ammunition personnel. No, Admiral Reyes interrupted. I need someone who can make decisions in real time, someone who understands both the technical requirements and the operational implications, someone who has proven they can function under extreme pressure when lives are at stake. The Admiral moved closer to Sarah, her expression both understanding and determined. I know you don't want this responsibility. I know you'd rather remain invisible and let someone else make the hard decisions, but we don't always get to choose when our capabilities are needed. Sarah looked down at the medal still clutched in her hands. The bronze felt warm from her touch, and for the first time in 18 months, she allowed herself to remember not just the terror of that night aboard the Milwaukee, but also the satisfaction of hearing 17 voices answer when roll call was taken after the rescue. 17 people who went home to their families because she had been willing to act when action was needed. What exactly are you asking me to do, ma'am? I'm asking you to take charge of ammunition operations for the next 72 hours. I'm asking you to coordinate weapons loading and distribution for both rescue operations and potential combat. And I'm asking you to accept a temporary promotion to Chief Petty Officer, so you'll have the authority to make those decisions without going through multiple levels of approval. The offer was extraordinary. A battlefield promotion 2 ranks above her current position. Authority over operations that would normally require years more experience, and responsibility for decisions that could affect the safety of the entire battle group. It was also exactly what Sarah had been trying to avoid for 18 months. "Admiral, I appreciate your confidence, but..." "Sarah, stop," Admiral Reyes said firmly. "I'm not asking you to be fearless. I'm asking you to be competent, which you've already proven you are. I'm not asking you to enjoy this responsibility. I'm asking you to accept it because you're the best person for the job." Sarah thought about the Philippines patrol vessel dead in the water somewhere ahead of them, about sailors who might be trapped or injured, about the complex decision matrix required to balance rescue operations with defensive preparations. She thought about the Chinese submarine that might be waiting to attack any ship that responded to the distress call. And she thought about Admiral Reyes, whose experience and judgment had identified Sarah as the person best qualified to handle an impossible situation. "If I accept this," Sarah said slowly, "I want Rodriguez promoted to Petty Officer 3rd Class to serve as my assistant. And I want Chief Johnson to remain as senior advisor. I'll need people I trust for this to work." Admiral Reyes smiled for the first time since Sarah had entered the compartment. "Done. Anything else?" Sarah stood up and carefully placed the Navy and Marine Corps medal around her neck, letting it rest openly against her dress blue jumper for the first time in 18 months. The weight of it no longer felt like a burden but like a reminder of what was possible when training, courage, and necessity converged. "I'll need direct communication access to the bridge, engineering, and the air wing commander. If I'm coordinating ammunition for simultaneous operations, I can't wait for messages to filter through normal channels." "You'll have it." Admiral Reyes extended her hand. "Chief Martinez, welcome to the job you've been running from for the past 18 months. As they shook hands, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The terror was still there. It probably always would be. But alongside it was a growing sense of purpose. She had spent 18 months trying to hide from the person who had earned the medal around her neck. But that person was exactly who the situation demanded. "Admiral, request permission to return to my division and begin ammunition reconfiguration." "Permission granted." "And Sarah? The next 72 hours are going to test every person aboard this ship. I'm counting on you to ensure we have the firepower to handle whatever we encounter." 6 hours later, as the USS Gerald R. Ford approached the coordinates where the Philippines patrol vessel waited for rescue, Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez stood in the Ammunition Control Center, coordinating the complex ballet of weapons loading that would allow the carrier to simultaneously conduct rescue operations and maintain defensive readiness. The Navy and Marine Corps medal hung proudly on her uniform, visible to every sailor under her command, and for the first time in 18 months, she was not afraid of the attention it drew. Around her, ammunition technicians worked with the precision and urgency that came from knowing their work would directly impact the survival of both rescued and rescuer. Rodriguez, now wearing the crow of a 3rd-class petty officer, managed logistics with newfound authority, while Chief Johnson provided the steady guidance that kept complex operations running smoothly. As the first rescue helicopters launched into the darkness toward the disabled patrol vessel, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She had not chosen to be a hero, and she still did not think of herself as one, but she was finally ready to be the person that circumstances demanded. Someone willing to accept responsibility, make hard decisions, and risk everything when lives were at stake. The USS Gerald R. Ford continued its passage through dangerous waters, and in its ammunition control center, a decorated sailor who had tried to hide her heroism had finally learned to embrace it. The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah realized that her 18-month effort to escape her past had finally come to an end. The Admiral was not going to accept evasion or deflection, and the crisis developing around them was too serious for games of concealment. With trembling hands, Sarah reached beneath her jumper and pulled out the Navy and Marine Corps medal, the ribbon bright against the dark fabric of her uniform. Admiral Reyes's expression did not change, but Sarah saw something flicker in her eyes, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of the burden that the medal represented. "Now," Admiral Reyes said quietly, "let's discuss why you've been hiding this, and why I think I'm going to need you to stop."